Hi folks, welcome to Code and Concrete, where we share the latest trends and the stories of trailblazers in the built environment. We hope you gain insight from our wide range of topics, such as real estate development and sustainability, or blockchain, artificial intelligence, and data. Joining us today is Tim Alvner. Tim has experience as a fintech startup founder, as well as a Big Four consultant. Now works as an advisor to small to medium-sized enterprises and startups. He specializes in financial planning, investment management, and the technologies underlying these for individuals, corporates, and larger asset managers from around the world, while residing in Hong Kong. Tim, welcome to the show.
Many thanks, Matthew. Great to see you again.
Yes, it's been how many months now? 1 month, maybe 2 months since Hong Kong FinTech Week. That was October, I think, and it's December.
Yeah, very tail end of October, yes.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure to be back in Hong Kong and to bring a bunch of people together because I got those free tickets for FinTech Week. So I'm really glad that you came on out and, we got to explore the city together. There's a lot to explore in Hong Kong.
Yes, it's a lot packed in a small little geographical footprint. So yeah, I guess that's the benefit when you build on the height.
So were you originally living in Hong Kong? Were you born in Hong Kong? Did you move to Hong Kong? What's the story there?
Basically, I'm half Swedish, half Thai. So I grew up basically not necessarily living in Thailand, but getting very familiar with airports at an early age. So I learned that the world's a big place, many different cultures, many different ways of looking at the world, and then looking at opportunities more from where do I want to be globally from an early age. And then I moved to Hong Kong for college originally. So coming up on half of my life in East Asia, sorry.
Really? Half your life in Hong Kong. So you moved there for college. What were you studying?
Physics, of all things.
Physics?
Oh,
physics.
Yes. Smart enough to get in, dumb enough to pick.
Yeah, I hear physics. I mean, that's got to be one of the toughest things to study, because it's really a mixture of, you got mathematics, you have science, and just the complexities of maybe the calculations. I mean, what makes physics challenging? Because I don't know. I just know it's tough.
I think effectively it could have been done better from my end to make it less tough, but I think that my understanding of the local education system and the level at which they were operating and the style was just so different from what was going on in Sweden. But yeah, realistically, you're trying to solve problems always with math, right? So from that perspective, you're given a situation, you don't necessarily have the tools and you have to figure it out effectively, or you don't have a roadmap. So here's a whole bunch of mathematical tools, figure out how to apply them, and then come out to a solution. And yeah, like it's a little struggle. But it's interesting and it's effectively applied math to a long series of problems.
And problems about the real world. So obviously that's one of our topics, the built world, the real world, things that are happening in problem solving. Physics plays a very important role in engineering in particular. Before we get into that, because in Hong Kong, you and I started talking about chemistry and renewable energy and all these fascinating things where physics is inevitably applied. But first, why are those things interesting to you? Because I've never thought about physics, to be honest. I know how gravity works, but I've never thought about physics. Is this something that is like a childhood interest, or did you just see a career interest? What was the story there?
I was just geeky, I guess. So yeah, like I like numbers, solving problems, math. Physics was pretty natural to harbor that into just problem solving. I didn't necessarily I'm interested in a lot of the things that physics deals with and asks about, like what is the edge of our observable reality and things like that from almost a philosophical perspective. And of course, like, can you take certain approaches and apply them in areas where basically the idea of symmetry in physics, if you can understand one method can you then apply it somewhere else and gain entirely new solutions and insights? And that to me is attractive. But yeah, like I wasn't exactly like, oh, like I'm going to dedicate my life to the electron or something like that, right? It wasn't exactly that direction or, yeah, like necessarily building houses or anything like that. It was just more of a way to apply math and curiosity for me.
I see. So you go to school, you study physics, something you're interested in from a broad scope. What was your first job, either in college or out of college, where you started to apply what you had studied?
I don't think I ever really have, but I also didn't look at it as like I'm studying to really learn how to move neutrons around or how like the black holes operate or anything like that, right? That was never the goal. Um, so effectively, again, manipulating math, solving problems. But realistically, some of the finance work that I've been doing, a lot of it is effectively um, it takes inspiration from physics. So, for example, the way that people price options, that's effectively for a physicist, the Black-Scholes equation is a heat transfer equation, and basically how temperature affects the formula is extremely similar to volatility in finance, etc. So, from that perspective, the thought processes are similar. And then almost immediately, effectively, where I started working for raising funds for a small IT startup back in the day, back in 2015 in Taiwan. That was effectively where you start coming into the idea of gradually progressing forecasts and like uncertainty and risk management. And those thought processes are very similar. And then pretty soon after that, I started going into like real financial modeling, portfolio construction, understanding how different investments impact each other, because I joined a robo advisory or investment management advisory startup, like with digital tools and solutions. We effectively wanted to help you build your own personalized hedge fund. We were very ambitious, let's put it like that. So our approach to that wasn't that let's beat the market, but more let's construct a set of risks and a set of financial positions that make a lot of sense for you, and to do that better than almost anyone else that were offering that to individuals. And they're effectively having that mindset, that thought process, understanding of how to balance an equation effectively was extremely helpful. So not necessarily directly, but the mathematical tool set really came in handy at that time.
This is the first time that I've heard that physics is sort of like finance. But I guess financial engineering, as you're describing, it's the mathematics behind that to take a set of problems and figure out what numbers, what variables do we have to consider in order to get a desired outcome and something that meets our parameters. In this case, it could be investment alpha or something that's sustainable growth. So you started working for this IT company in Taiwan, correct?
Yes, the first
that was
one.
sort of the transition there. And then this is your first exposure to a lot of the applied financial stuff and helping them, or was that more on the robo advisory? Because you've been an advisor in multiple roles. So I guess first let's unpack what that means, to be an advisor. What does it mean for you?
Basically, like in terms of what I'm doing, it depends so much on who I'm speaking to and where I can apply my experiences in the best way. So I don't necessarily package myself too much into, okay, let's go and dive super deep into financial strategy and controls and managing, if someone doesn't really know how to construct a balance sheet, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot about like understanding the position of where the person comes from and what their challenges really are. And in some cases, like aligning on that. I think that a lot of people have knowledge, but it takes a little bit of working with people and working with projects to really be able to get to the point where you actually come to an alignment on what the problem is and how you prefer to solve it. And that, I think, is like more than half the problem as an advisor, because everyone can have an opinion, everyone can make a try on solving a problem, but realistically in business or in any kind of real human interaction, the final solution and the answer on the page rarely is falsifiable. True or false is often like a scale, and in that context, coming to the point where you can actually go in the right direction, or as far as possible in that direction, is the most important thing. And then building the relationship is crucial.
So building the relationship so that as you draw near to a conclusion with this founder, you're aligned.
Yes.
Like if I'm hearing this correctly, you're talking about vision alignment, and you might find a solution, but actually agreeing that that solution is the real solution.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's say, for example, right, if I've been working as a consultant at a Big Four, and maybe one of the examples here is pretty telling. We were working on implementing a massive IT system for a large bank. And there were 3-4 different candidates for that system. So should you use this particular tool from that particular vendor and these different, with these different features, or should you use the other one? Of course, they're competitive, but then the question is, can you actually get the vision aligned with the team? Can you get all of them? Can you basically make sure that maybe you give something up on the system side, but you gain something on the business side, back and forth. And then you're not right or wrong, right? Like, should you be more systems or more business? Well, like both of them have purpose. But the main point is, can you actually get the team behind you? Because if you're not aligned, then you don't get a system. And that's the big problem, right?
Right, because you could be offering to put a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get people to rally on that. Even if your advice could be correct or proper, it might get you to, or perhaps you've used your own advice, in a previous startup where you had a square peg and you said, this is how I did it. This is how I want to apply it. And the founder is saying, look, I've got a different vision. And look, I appreciate the advice. So actually, I'd like to unpack, how do you go about that sort of problem resolution where there's perhaps ego involved? How are you settling this?
I understand that I'm an advisor, not a director. I've been a founder before, and the main job as a founder, or like the way I look at it, is to solve problems really quickly. Can you build a product? Can you find product market fit? Can you find like the audience? Can you extract money from that audience? Like all of those things, right, require a lot of information, and it's so rare to have all that information. So hence doing a lot of trials, testing, being out, like really like hitting the market or hitting the problem and gaining those insights. And as an advisor, you provide a couple of data points, but providing the whole roadmap when most of the time you probably don't really understand the problem as well as the founders do, I think that's a fool's errand. So my approach to being an advisor is always, I advise, I don't direct. And having been on the other side and having people not understand that difference, trust me, I know how frustrating that can be.
Well, that's good. And as a founder myself, I appreciate when people offer advice, but they're not trying to steer the ship. And I think that when you start to offer equity to people, that dynamic very quickly gets convoluted, where now there's potential loss, there's skin in the game. And if someone feels that they're going to lose something, they could become a little bit more demanding, or if they have leverage, then they'll start to guide the company in a direction that, I mean, who knows if it's right or not, but still, it's not the ultimate vision. And if there's one thing that a startup has to be unified on, it's the vision. I mean, you can have different methods to getting there, but you got to have the same endpoint.
Yes. Yeah, it's tough, right? Because a lot of the time you should be flexible enough to what the market demands. And sometimes it's just like, yeah, we can get this deal. And if we get this particular deal, that puts us in an entirely different step, but it might nudge the direction in a way that wasn't originally envisaged. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it's definitely one of those things that takes time and effort to consider. Because yeah, like those conversations are never easy. So I think that from the perspective of like, then you get into the question of like control, cap table construction, and who owns what and who has what, like steer on the company. But yeah, that's always, again, the relationship piece, right? There is no quote unquote right or wrong. It's a spectrum of interest and resolution methodologies, frankly speaking.
I imagine that, well, actually, the example that you gave of implementing new technology or changing the tech stack, I mean, this is something that, small and medium-sized enterprises or large, and startups have to change very frequently, like what the best technology is. It gets more difficult as you scale, and there can be even more discrepancies, especially around risk. Like we might be taking too much of a leap of implementing this technology. And I know that that's true because when we talk about blockchain and artificial intelligence going into construction or banking, there's so much hesitancy and concern, and the implementation process can go from 6 months to 6 years. So I want to ask you, what, from your experience, what has been the biggest hurdle to getting companies to, adopt technology or to change a methodology, even if it, turns out to be good? They're hesitant at first. You got to walk them through that. You're offering advice. Where are these hurdles, and how do you overcome them?
So I think it depends a little bit on the scale. So I'll just break it down into large and small from that perspective. Starting on the small angle, I think it's just a question of, can these people be specialized in what they're doing? Do they have the bandwidth to look at the technologies and solutions? There are ways of managing customer relationship management. There's ways of managing invoicing. There's ways of managing your bank management, HR. Like, you can go on, right? Your marketing, like there are probably somewhere between 20 and 50 systems, depending on the kind of company that you're running. And that's pretty much for like 1 through 5 people scale of business. And keeping on top of all of that and relearning it, getting effective. You always lose a little bit when you don't know the system, etc. Right? So at some point, you need to give yourself runway to get up and let the flywheel run. So from that perspective, I think that for founders, for smaller companies, startup level, unless it's core, maybe try and get people that are specializing in it. I mean, I'm focusing on finance, and I can't keep up with a lot of the systems that are coming out and really assessing them deep down. It's at some point you basically have to take a bet, and you play the hand you're given, and you pour money into that. For a larger company, it's a little bit more of an issue. I think that the cost of change now scales up exponentially, right? If you can't get the people that are working in the system behind, if you can't actually transition fast, then effectively the cost of doing this, and if something becomes worse, or if you have client questions or anything like that that comes up and really makes the post-implementation challenging, that's massive. And I think that a lot of people, when you're thinking about a system, they tend to go, well, but this system is like 50 to 100% better than what you have at the moment. But yeah, like 5 years, there will be something which is 50 to 100% better than what this system is. And in that period, if you've taken a hit, which basically impacts 50% of your business for some risk or from some process, that's a much bigger challenge. And therefore, I think that a lot of people jump into an implementation without having such a clear view of how much bigger the business can be. And sometimes they just make that decision without having sufficiently bankable benefits post-implementation for it to be worthwhile. So yeah, I mean, like if you're spending X amount of money on an implementation, that takes 3 years on a system. Now all of a sudden you implement the system and that's already 3 years out of date. And now you have, let's say, another 2 years before something else comes out. And do you have enough time in those 2 years to catch up on that gap, right? Those questions, can you get the entire team behind you? Does that work from a whole bunch of political or regulatory perspectives internally? The questions become a lot more complicated all of a sudden.
I think what you just described, though, perfectly encapsulates what's been happening with blockchain and AI, though.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the adoption and maturation curve of these technologies, it's probably 7, 8, 9 years in the making since the fundamental ideas, the concepts of machine learning and blockchain went mainstream. Maybe back in 2016 or 2015, Bitcoin was becoming prominent and people were saying, hey, this could revolutionize banking. You saw some companies that were interested in adopting the technology. Some did, some failed. Others were really, really patient with it. And the banks in particular. And I think that part of the reason is what you just described. If we totally overhaul our current ledgers and how we move value and information, and then something about blockchain or adjacent technologies completely changes, and now you've put millions of dollars into disrupting a system, and it turns out to be for the worse, and you have to scrape things together. There's money at stake, people's finances. You could have loss, you could have disruption, corruption, theft. Things go really, really wrong. But I think, fortunately, we're at the point now where blockchain, which I'm most excited about, has reached maturation, and it's shown that it's not going to be changes every 5 years and you got to figure something else. It's here to stay. And you hear that a lot, that this time is the real deal. The technology is here to stay. And that's why you're seeing financial institutions looking at blockchain or asking, how can we start to tokenize? And I know that you have some thoughts on tokenization. So how did, with blockchain and AI, what was your first exposure to that? And we'll start there, but I've got some great follow-up questions. What was your first exposure to these technologies?
So I think AI is a little bit of a question of gradation. So are we talking about like large language models or Gen AI? I've been a little bit behind on that. I think that it looked to me like a new iteration of the machine learning boom that came out in 2016, effectively, where that initial hedge fund robo-advisory company that I was with, our approach to the market was basically to have a machine learning algorithm run on the market and then pick out information from that and then apply that out. And I think that in terms of the conversation around neural networks and node management and like all of those pieces on the more in the weeds of the machine learning piece, that's effectively where I started getting more professionally involved in all of this. And I think that a lot of the companies that were in the same accelerator program, this was back in the heyday of like Singapore Fintech Festival just starting, Hong Kong Fintech Festival had its first run, right? Like back in 2015 at the time. So I was right there in that in that zeitgeist. And effectively, like everyone was super hype about it, and it was super cool and everything. And I think that conceptually, programmable money and programmable, like the way that can then lead to things like programmable investments from a token level, I think should already have revolutionized fund management. Like a fund is effectively a number of assets that you're managing on a mandate. That mandate can be written into a couple of pieces of code I've done that myself multiple times. I don't see any reason why that can't be run on an Ethereum smart contract, right? So from that perspective, having an extremely clear fund or like an adjustable fund for every individual, whatever, right? Like the opportunities are almost endless, and I haven't seen anything like that. The same thing almost for virtually any financial contract. If you start looking into how a lot of the derivatives that effectively run the world multiple times of like global GDP are traded in like the underlying value of these contracts, right? Of course, like that money doesn't end up moving, but you're having interest rates that are based off of, well, like basically you're earning a return every year that's driven by mortgage-backed securities in the US, and those markets are multiple times the size of the GDP of the US if you look at how much assets are being traded underneath there, right? So there, of course, like everyone's trying to take as much money as they can in between, and I don't see a reason why you can't code that contract in and have the middlemen go away and do something more economically valuable, right?
Do you think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been rapidly adopted, because there's so many intermediaries holding on for dear life so that they can continue to make their millions? Or if that's not why, what do you think is why?
I don't think that enough people think about these intermediaries. So from that perspective, like, and there are existing business relationships kind of that like no one really thinks to disrupt because no one really benefits from it in that perspective. So from that perspective, like if I'm looking at it that way, like it does make a certain amount of sense. No one walks around and goes, yeah, like that 0.02% interest rate on my mortgage really hurts. You know, like no one cares about that, like $10, whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, fine, it's 2 Starbucks coffees and it's like one payment at the end of the month. So it's very easy to not think about these things, and no one really feels the pain unless they're in the corporate world, and then they probably extract value from it either way. So from that perspective, and also like another thing I've learned in finance is that trust matters a lot, right? People are willing to give a lot of money to people they trust for good or bad, right? That's arguably why finance is rife with fraud. That you can get people that sound very trustworthy, and then all of a sudden they go, well, trust me, bro, this will go well. And then all of a sudden the money is gone, right? So I think that there are multiple layers to that. But the other thing, the main thing, even going so far down as to things that normal people actually can feel a frustration about, like their investment opportunities or like the investment commissions that they're paying, etc. A lot of that, I think, ultimately comes down to processes and data. I can imagine amazing financial services, and I've worked with consultancy firms that have visions of what you can do in terms of financial services. But frankly speaking, if you look at the data, like implementing AI and blockchain for a lot of banks when most of their data is sitting in paper format. Yeah, I mean, you can fire up the oven, you can get an anvil, you can buy the best hammer, but if you don't have steel, you're not going to make any swords. Like if the iron ore is still in the ground, nothing's going to happen. And that's fundamentally the way that I look at a lot of this. And I mean, it's the way that a lot of these institutions just handle data to begin with means that a new technology can come around, but they aren't ready for it. And I don't know how many times I've seen people talk about like how much, like one of the major things we should do is to rearrange the schedule for the truck to move paper from one building to another. How many times that's a meaningful conversation in a bank is kind of scary.
Okay, so a lot of good things to unpack there. First, when you talk about finance and trust, I think would be interesting to bring up that today is the 16th anniversary of Bernie Madoff getting arrested who, of course, was responsible for a $65 billion Ponzi scheme.
Yes.
Next, your point about these little areas where value is lost, but they're so minute that people overlook it. To me, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, because those numbers do add up, in aggregates. And so we might ignore a couple dollars here, a couple dollars there. But then when you start talking about economies of scale and corporatism, as you mentioned, these things start to become problematic. And so it does make sense to start to make systems or processes more programmable and streamlined. And perhaps peer-to-peer is really what it is. Because if you take out the intermediary, something immediately becomes peer-to-peer, which is what a blockchain helps with. But you're right that if the data is not in digital format, or if it is and it's antiquated and not structured, usable, accessible, right? If it's sitting at the edge in a filing cabinet in a building, and we don't know what that information is, we don't know the relevancy of it, if it's even accurate in the first place, who was involved in putting it together, then you really have compromised data. And you can have, there's so many layers to this onion. There's this problematic onion that you've just described. And these are a lot of the things that we try to solve at building, where, okay, let's get some accurate data. Let's lock that down to the blockchain once we know that it's accurate information, structure that, make it accessible to different stakeholders and usable. Where do you think this starts, right? So if we're talking about financial institutions and we want to begin overhauling systems, we know we have to start with data. Is it just digitization? Like you mentioned that a lot of stuff is in paper format. Is that really super widespread that you've seen, and we just need to start getting things on computers?
Effectively. Then I think also like doing it smart is helpful, because like, okay, if you do a project and everything has to be digital all of a sudden, right? I've fairly recently gone into a bit of consulting work over here in Hong Kong, where like one of the property managers, like they have loans in the tens of millions of US dollars, right, to finance their properties. All of it on paper for decades. Like,
why? And why isn't it changing?
Because I guess that's just how they run their business. They don't want to, or realistically, I don't think they have time to spend a couple of months digitizing all their documents. And are you going to have scanned files of all of the stuff that you keep in your filing cabinet and categorizing that and making that searchable? That's challenging, right? So none of that is easy, especially when the stuff is kind of faded and like not super machine readable and like difficult even for a trained human eye to figure out. And then going back through, the bank even has statements for those decades, right? So from that perspective, the transition to digital is going to be painful. I think it's not a snap your fingers and do it kind of thing. And that also leads, I think, to a lot of institutions that are going into that, maybe having to run those in parallel. You need to have the physical service and you need to have the digital service at the same time. And now all of a sudden you need two training paths, you need two different ways of handling, you need to have two different control management systems and like escalation chains, etc., depending on what you have. And frankly speaking, that tends to be organizationally complex, right? All of a sudden you're coming back to these questions of, this client of mine is great. They've been with us for 100 years, family office, whatever. They built their fortune building X amount of properties. And now we're implementing a different solution for them than they had before. And these guys that have just bought their second investment property are coming in and getting a better service than these guys, right? You get into all of those problems. So realistically, it's not easy to just snap your fingers and go, okay, we're digital now, right?
This sounds like a problem that we face of not digital duplicates, but essentially when you have the offline copy and you can have a digital copy, but there's no guarantee that those two are tethered. And so you can continue to perform operations offline or off-chain, and you have information on-chain or online that is not accurate to what's happening in the real world. And in real estate in particular, there's such a gap, or any sort of real-world asset. When you talk about tokenization and creating new financial assets and instruments that are reflective of something tangible, if you don't have a really good way of monitoring the physical state, the actual performance and health of that asset, then you're still living in la la land, this fantasy where you have a financial instrument that actually isn't properly backed. You can say that it's backed by the real world asset, but if you don't even know if the real world asset is there, right? Because I could create tokenized art, and then it turns out that the underlying art that I thought was in someone's warehouse was stolen and replaced with a replica, and it's not real. Well, that completely, catastrophizes I don't know if that's a word, but it disrupts the concept of my digital asset, right? So it bugs me that I can't think of what the proper term for, having discrepancy between the offline stuff and the online stuff. But that's, I think, probably the biggest problem right now.
Yeah, and I think the vision for like blockchain absolutists of like an entirely trustless economy, I think is kind of hard to achieve. Or I can't envision how that works when you actually interface with the physical world, right? Or especially for legacy assets, or let's call anything that isn't tokenized legacy assets for the time being. And if you don't have a massive data stream, like you do for an exchange, for example, or if you're building a new asset with those data streams attached and all of the infrastructure rails to monitor their activity throughout, I think that's going to be a problem. But then I think instead, like if you take a slightly different angle to things, the way that you're doing it at building, for example, with like going from the ground up, really building those infrastructure layers on the real estate assets. Yeah, like brilliant. And like some of the stuff that I'm seeing as well in like particular asset types that have natural transaction flows, right? If you have a shipping container, like you're not getting that through port unless you get a certain amount of import signage on it and everything like that. In those cases, those transactions can definitely be digitized and stored in a way, and then just like rebuilding that framework with additional digitization and some effectivization. Sure. I can definitely see a place where, for example, power markets in the future, if we're looking at renewable energies and stuff like that, or if we're looking at the way that a building or a factory or something might need power, then all of a sudden, all of those flows have massive amounts of data. So there, I think that the hurdle is smaller. But yeah, am I going to tokenize my uncle's boat that he's had for a number of years? Or like, it's going to be a slightly different experience.
Right. Well, part of that's regulation. If something is regulated and there's oversight and those expectations, like getting through a port, you don't get through a port accidentally. There's many people, many instances, many checkboxes involved. And that's why I focus on commercial real estate, because it is regulated. If I tokenize individual houses, I have absolutely no way of mandating that certain information needs to be uploaded at certain times. And you're never going to get, at least here in the US, the free American populace to abide by our very high expectations. You can only look at the commercial properties that are used to oversight and, having to fit into a box, into a template, because they're dealing with municipalities and there's liability and many stakeholders involved. The other idea that comes to mind is IoT. I think IoT will solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about, where there's data sitting at the edge, meaning that it's not centralized, it's not accessible to us, maybe it's not even digitalized, it's with the asset itself.
Yeah.
But if we can have real-time data streams, and this is why I think, renewable energy and solar are really good candidates with tokenized real estate, because they are a source of real-time information. And this was where our conversation first started when we had connected. So I want to hear more. Let's just open that up. Let's start with, well, first, how did you get into renewable energy and your interest there?
So yeah, effectively, I owe it to a couple of mentors that have dragged me kicking and screaming from the greedy world of finance and trying to make money that way into trying to solve problems. So I earned a little bit on the way after my physics degree. And then effectively, I guess it's coming full circle now. But yes, a number of my advisors effectively, one in particular that I spoke to a lot over the last decade, and one more recently who's been a former manager of mine. So yeah, like effectively one of them dealing with sustainable energy more broadly, the other one dealing with batteries, and yeah, so I've jumped into that space for a number of different opportunities. I started talking quite a bit with a guy that does solar panel installations, and he looks at the power markets, particularly in Hong Kong, in a very interesting way, and sees some of these massive market dislocations and ways that some of these can help with that. And from that perspective, again, as you mentioned, solar and real estate. Some of my friends have been involved in the real estate market, and hence why I got that contract to deal with the real estate issues and looking through reams and reams of paper. But that same family that had that had those problems that I've been consulting over for the last couple of weeks, they also had a certain real estate portfolio that might be applicable for certain solar installations. So they came together a couple of years ago, and we explored some items. There was a lot of back and forth. Again, unfortunately, one of those things that didn't pan out necessarily anywhere, but building stronger relationships with both of those angles, again, trying to be helpful as an advisor, not trying to set out direction, really helped quite a bit. And now I'm maintaining relationships with both of them for good commercial reasons. But yeah, ultimately started looking at the solar panels, started thinking about some of the issues, or like some of the sensitivities of solar panels, what you need to care about, and how some of the market condition, or like what some of the conditions for having solar panels on in Hong Kong are. And it basically got my mind racing. So that's where basically that conversation came up. Again, it's super immature at the moment, and yeah, like literally not something I'm going to raise money off of anytime soon. But effectively, the broader idea is that if something is sensitive to something, then it's annoying that you can't get the same amount of power out of it, but on the other hand, you can also get data from it, and that gives you a separate cash flow stream if you can actually monetize that data. And I think that we're all pretty used to effectively our data being monetized to in the ways that we're being advertised to. So yeah, like trying to find a different way to use exogenous data that comes out of systems to generate cash flow that hopefully is slightly less intrusive than your phone trying to sell you whatever they were talking about on the last TV show you're watching.
And with DeFi, that monetization can be kicked back to the owner of that solar asset. So help me understand the sensitivities that you're talking about. What do you mean when you say that?
So, for example, if we're talking about let's say a solar panel, just for the sake of it, right? So from a physical perspective, it's a diode more or less, or like it's a semiconductor. So you hit it with some rays of sun, and then the electrons move from one place to the other. This generates a lot of heat, and unfortunately the heat is not very helpful for the functioning of the solar cell. But effectively, if you know how much sun you're getting, now you have a thermometer.
Mm-hmm.
So you can monitor the power and you can figure out if you have a thermometer, or you can figure out the temperature, to be more accurate. Now, let's say that it's a very sunny day. The solar panel is going to operate because of them generating power. It's going to heat up. So it's going to operate at a higher temperature than the environment around it. Gust of wind will cool it down. Now your temperature change can help you tell how windy it is. Now you get a cloud coming in the way. Now you've basically built a solar, wind, and temperature detector.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Have you seen any implementations of that? I had someone, present to me the heat that is being generated, and in the example that they were dealing with, in some of that energy was going to servers, which were then producing more heat. To the best of their ability, they were trying to vertically capture all of that heat and push it throughout the building as an energy efficiency.
Yeah.
So that's one way I've heard of companies trying to roll out, like it's almost cross-functional utilities. Have you seen any examples, implementations? I know this is something that you were talking about a little bit. I don't even know if that's confidential, but where are you seeing this? Where would you like to see it? Are you going to be the one to roll it out?
I have a couple of different angles for it, because I think that the data probably isn't, again, you're not meeting those requirements for added value. You haven't created enough bankable benefits for rolling something out. And I think that I have to stare so far into the future on very uncertain ground. So effectively from a financial perspective, it becomes risk at that point. So that projection, I'm going to go further before I say something which is so dumb that basically it's going to sure podcast look that weirdly. But no, effectively I'm not too careful about any of that. It's just I need to validate a couple of things with people that know what they're talking about. And then I hope that effectively, if I'm looking into that future and you're looking at grid power trading, you're looking at the ways that you need heating and cooling in different places, battery storage, and how all of that will interface with a market and some of the greatest value I can find in that market. That unlocks later, but because kind of the same thing as you see in some startups, if you're building a marketplace, you need buyers and sellers. And then each of those can introduce faults to your business model and challenges in how anything operates. So the more groups of actors you bring together, the more risk. Unfortunately, for something like this to work, I think at the moment I'm having too many groups that I haven't risk controlled enough to make it a business out of it. But it's definitely something that's interesting. But I think that in some of the other projects that I'm looking at and some of the other people I'm advising, the very alternate ways of looking at certain accessible tools or accessible structures, it is really helpful for that. So for example, I'm advising a whiskey distillery venture, hoping to build a distillery up in Japan.
That's awesome.
If it works, right? Great on paper. Hoping it actually gets there eventually. But we're looking very carefully about how can we manage the power that's needed, or the energy that's needed to distill the whiskey, right? And can we get other things out of it? There's a massive movement on sustainability there. Where are you sourcing the energy from? What are you using it for? Are you just pouring the energy out of the water, out somewhere else? Are you using it, basically some of the waste heat, to help power the nearby hotels? Or are you going to set up an onsen or something like that crazy with the extra heat that comes out of that once it's cooled down to the point where people can actually enjoy it? So a lot of those questions I think are interesting, where you start thinking about resources in a slightly different way. And I think that the closest thing that I can see to that is almost like the way that Elon Musk thinks about things, right? And the way that he communicates them. When he talks about, okay, it doesn't make sense to have airplanes which have space rockets because at a certain point the air resistance weighs up for the fact of going to orbital launch. And like the way that he's able to break those things down and go to go deeper into first principles to look at problems, I think that that's a really helpful way of like looking at the world and problems and directions for solutions. Then, of course, as you probably heard as well, sometimes it's just like the bank has data in paper. Like it's not the best way of solving a problem, but therefore the money required to solve that problem and bring all of the legacy data on means that you can't just snap your fingers and have a change, right? So there's a little bit of, I think, a meeting of fundamental problem solving and entirely new out of the box ways of looking at things. And also like a close understanding of like, what are we actually working with here? Especially in finance, and I can imagine real estate as well, where you have a lot of legacy and a lot of ways that things have been built poorly, both physically and like structurally from a process perspective. And like sometimes that just precludes solutions.
Well, it's part of the reason that we're focusing on new developments, because I can tokenize property, but I can't guarantee that the property itself is a high quality asset. And so if I'm going to give a stamp of approval and have this wrapper of value that people are going to trade, they're going to use as collateral, they're going to believe in, to me, it needs to represent something greater. It needs to show compliance of the building itself, of securities and other regulations, of financial reporting, environmental impact, so that tokens become a gold standard of real estate. It elevates the investment process, because if you just tokenize properties themselves, we haven't seen any value that is derived from that. And that goes back to what you were talking about around investing in the technology, but unsure what the KPIs, the deliverables, the outcomes are going to be, the return on investment, if this is actually worth our time and capital, especially if it's always changing. And we've been trying to navigate this ourselves to show, okay, how can we get all of the value out of blockchain and artificial intelligence and put that into a platform so that when you pay for that, when you implement that, you can actually tangibly measure hours saved, dollars saved, and suddenly it becomes worth it. Like, it makes sense to put this in my next property because this is the percentage. And then, how can I reuse those funds for a second property? And I think that that completely changes how people interpret technology. But elevating assets and just having good assets in the first place, that's such a widespread problem. People don't realize it. They don't understand it. It's like skeletons in the closet, as I say. But it's amazing. Our financial system globally is as resilient as it is because it's almost a house of cards.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people think of resilience almost as rigidity, but I think that the amount of people that all of a sudden get to work trying to patch like everything up with like shoestrings and bubblegum are kind of like, it's kind of insane when you see it happen in real life, right? It was pretty interesting to me one time when right around when the market impact of COVID-19 hit. I remember I was consulting for a bank, and the system that informed the bankers about the client's collateral position on the portfolios for like margin supported portfolios. The clients have borrowed a lot of money to invest in the markets. Pretty popular everywhere, more so lately, but definitely so in Hong Kong. That system went off so often that no one can do their job. So they shut the system down. And then people were running off of Excel, right? And like the kind of ways that the regulatory team and the lending team were working 24/7 for that week, like just setting up shifts, everything. Like the way that the IT team came together on like, on call all times. I know people that were pulling 2-3 hours of sleep a night, right, through that. And that was for a small unit of like a large and complex bank, but their business itself isn't complex, right? They just have their arms everywhere, but they aren't necessarily doing the most complex and crazy stuff. It's nothing like the likes of, let's say, Credit Suisse, right? And from that perspective, like it was so telling to me, right? Like the idea or like the thought process in the financial crisis of '08, right around when Bernie Madoff was flushed out, where like the common saying was, we can't change finance because we've built a spaghetti of systems on top of another spaghetti of systems like it's spaghetti all the way, right? And it's so unfortunate that that's the way it is. But these systems are so complex that it is pretty natural that happens. And when there are always areas that aren't like brought up to the same standards, and that's almost unavoidable based on some of the real estate discussions that we've had before, like you're going to end up in a mess when things shift quickly.
So as we, approach the end of our conversation here, I want to segue and kind of take it off of the built world and finance and just talk about Hong Kong. So I've got guests from all over the world. I want to ask, what makes Hong Kong a good city for startups, fintechs, businesses, entrepreneurs? Is it a good city? What are your thoughts?
I mean, Hong Kong has always been super enterprising, so there's very much of a direct, like people here are direct. Things move fast. It's easy from a regulatory perspective to do a lot of things. On the other hand, like the way that a lot of, let's say, startups operate at the moment, that you need to spend a lot of time, you need to like test the market, etc., especially for something more consumer driven, and you start very, very small and then gradually scale up. That's kind of harder, I think, especially at the moment in Hong Kong, unless you're doing something brick and mortar where you can get like a slightly higher level of revenue just by opening and saying, hey, I'm opening a new ice cream shop, and then do a little bit of marketing, and then you have a line in front of your store day one. But if you're starting an IT startup and you need to spend a year or two figuring that out, Hong Kong is costly and difficult. But on the other hand, you do have an incredible professional service function here, like the way that banks, lawyers, consultants are basically tripping over each other, accountants, everything. Like the amount of resources you can pull out from that perspective is amazing. And the amount of larger, fairly well-structured companies that are around. So basically the core of the message is B2C might be a little bit challenging if you're trying to do a normal startup and scalable, challenging. But if you're going B2B and you have a team of more experienced people that can crack open those doors, yeah, Hong Kong has always been doing that, or has been doing that kind of business for the last couple of decades, and it's still likely a rife area where it's a little bit China light at the moment. So if you want to have a China or larger East Asia presence, then that's where I would say that the benefits are.
So when it comes to fintech startups or just tech startups, it could be prop tech, but the 0 to 1 seems a little difficult in Hong Kong, but once you're at 1, because of the resources and the professionals that exist there, to scale seems a lot more. You can do so efficiently. Is that a good synopsis?
I think so, but I think it's also like an adjustment of expectations, right? You probably aren't going to take over the world from Hong Kong, to be entirely honest. Like the likelihood that you will create an Uber or something equivalent, or like a Zillow even, or a Facebook or whatever, is basically non-existent in Hong Kong because the local market simply isn't that big. And
I
that
see.
the way that, yeah, you can get to fairly easily a couple of $100 million in like earnings before interest, interest and taxes, or EBITDA in finance. But fundamentally, there's a little bit of a cap after that, right? You're not going to become this like, and therefore it's a little bit harder for VCs that are targeting like Hong Kong focused startups as a result, because the likelihood that they will have one investment that they make that returns 3 times the fund of them is a little bit harder. But therefore, like, the strategy, I would say, almost for that, and especially in fintech, prop tech, things that work on large B2B companies, is to basically have that, like 0 to 1, you have to figure out in your own garage. You have to figure out how to do that kind of separately and get to 1 on your own. And then the 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, Hong Kong is great for that. Solution is great enough, and you have the network. And then going from 100 and beyond, like, you need to know that early on that you can't achieve here either.
Interesting. Well, great insight there. Yeah, I mean, we've covered such a range of topics, from finance and physics to blockchain and real estate, but I think that that's what makes for a really great conversation. And that's, a big reason why I put together the podcast, because there's crossroads between all of these topics. And sometimes it's at those crossroads that niche discoveries and niche products can be started and they can be brought to market. And I think it goes back to that 1,000 paper cuts issue that finance has. It might be something that's really, really overlooked because it's minute, but that's an opportunity for someone to build something, bring out a solution. And if they can get people to care enough about it, then it's going to be adopted. I think that's the big thing with tokenization and blockchain right now, where it's solving these problems that have been overlooked for 100 years, but people have made such a fuss about it in Web3, and we're hosting Web3 and blockchain events around the world, and people are talking about it, that you're sort of forced to pay attention and to consider it and think, should Bitcoin be in my investment portfolio? Should I have a Web3 wallet? Will I need it one day to access certain things, or a digital identity? So it's opportunity, right? Every problem is an opportunity. I think you said something like that, something similar to that earlier.
Yeah, it's a familiar tune for sure, right? Like, there's a quote I can't remember like verbatim right now this early in the morning my time, but like in one of my consulting gigs, we had to pick a quote that would reflect us, and Niels Bohr has a quote that I really love for that. He's a Danish Nobel Prize winning physicist. And he has like a number of stories around him. He's probably the person that, or he was effectively the person that discovered the some of the first signs of the quantum mechanics of the atom, and that basically atoms work in certain ways, and he was one of the first that discovered some of those. And basically he says that any sufficiently challenging problem has its solution embedded in it. You just need to think carefully about it, and it's your job to uncover that solution. And like, coming from that guy, I found that to be profound. But I'll have to dig up a joke about Niels Bohr that a lot of people will appreciate, and send that over to you on a personal level. It's the guy thought in a different way than most other people.
Well, you have to. I was just looking at the best loser wins which is about trading.
Yeah.
And being normal doesn't solve problems. It doesn't make you money, so there's the alternative perspective to think outside of the box, to be
Yeah.
cliche, has value for sure, for sure. So my final question before we wrap this up, as an advisor to any sort of startup founder, no industry specific, what sort of advice, and this is broad, we can narrow it down, but what's the first piece of advice that you offer to a founder? What is it? Is it mindset? Is it industry? Is it location? Is it systems in place? What's the first thing that they should think about? What's your advice there?
Do faster.
Do
Simply
faster.
put, like it's a lot of people sit in their rooms and think, or they build something, like uh, get evidence of your business working, and like that I would say is crucial. I see so many people that have kind of gone away from, like, I think that too many people joined startups and that trained back in 2015, 2016, and arguably I'm one of them. Right, so I got something out of it by shifting into consulting later on. But ultimately, I think too many people jumped on the bandwagon there. But what I saw there was at least that people were reading up on, like, how do you do it? And now I think that some of the nuts and bolts of testing an idea have kind of gone out the way. I'm seeing so many people that are focusing more on the solution than the problem. And as a result, they don't necessarily know if anyone actually has the problem. And that's arguably something where, like, you can come with whatever angle you want, but you actually need to test it in the market. You need to get some proof. And without that proof of there being a market that you can sell to it, that, like, you understand that, like, that all those things fit together, it's really hard to grow the company ultimately, right? So a lot of conversations I'm having with people are, oh, like, do you know investors? Yes. Oh, but like, I need money. Yeah, but like they're not ATMs, and they don't fund people. Like 0 to 1 is a very, very difficult area to be in, and realistically, outside of the US, I don't think that there are a lot of investors that are doing that. And frankly speaking, the people that are raising money in the 0 to 1 stage on a larger ticket are the ones that have either industry experience or have done a startup before. And like a lot of people go in and go like, okay, like the job market is a little bit tough. I wanted to have like a bit more freedom. I'll start a company, right? And I'll do my own vision and my own idea. And like they don't focus on what the market wants. They don't focus on what's fundable, what isn't fundable, what you need to show before you are fundable. And then you end up in a whole bunch of tears, but hopefully also lessons for when those people come back on the other track. And I think like some of the experience that you've shared as well about like how you're looking at building and some of the approaches, like definitely a lot more of that would be helpful broadly in the entrepreneur community, especially here. I think that a lot of people are, yeah, like they look at massive fundraising rounds for people getting money on a sketch, but not realizing like all of the stuff that happened behind that, and think that they can just roll up to an investor that they don't know with a PowerPoint that they put together the night before, right? When what they're benchmarking against is a person who ran a startup before and built a relationship with those investors over years, if not decades, right?
Right, right. And you're right. That's our approach, considers that. And it was because we tried to get to markets and build an MVP, something that wasn't getting traction. And so I had to pivot a couple
Yeah.
times. And I really had to understand what the customer wanted. That big question that we've been asking, what's the ROI on the other end of this? You want me to pay for this? What's the ROI? How does this actually improve our property? And solving that, or at least getting in that direction, has been a game changer for us. Yeah. And quite frankly, it makes life much easier when you really know the value proposition. And I can say, you're saving this money, it improves this, it automates that, helps you here. They're like, oh, I get it. Cool.
Yeah.
And then the product starts to speak for itself. So absolutely. I think a lot of entrepreneurs quit before they get there. because you're probably going to fail first.
Yeah.
And you got to try again and, innovate off of what you learned the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I almost feel a little bit like I pivoted as many times as I tossed and turned in bed. Or like you hear people talking about pivoting, like, yeah, like I had a coffee, I pivoted. I had my lunch, I pivoted. And in some cases these days, I'm seeing people start a company and shut it down without ever pivoting. And that to me is kind of scary. And that's where I appreciate any conversation with entrepreneurs that are more focused around finding that, working so much to get the data to make the right decisions. And many times those are pivots, because ideas aren't born complete, right? They take a lot of testing to do. And that's probably an angle that applies both in physics and in business and startups. Ideas rarely survive completely intact when they get in contact with reality.
Well said. Some wisdom right there. Well, Tim.
Sorry.
You're going to say something
no, sorry.
after that? Well, last thing I want to do is if people want to get in touch with you, where's the best place? Any links, any sites, any social medias that people should reach out to you on?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest. Yeah. So yeah, it's easy to mute me or disconnect as well if it's getting too annoying to see my posts.
Well, the good news is I'll have your LinkedIn in the show notes below where people can check that out. They can connect with you, talk with you about renewable energy, blockchain, financial advisory, fintech startups, fund management, asset management. Got a lot of great characteristics, skills, and interests that you've got there, Tim. So kudos to you. And of course, anyone in Hong Kong, they're, in good company. They reach out to you and maybe grab a coffee sometime.
Sounds great. Yeah, I guess I never got successful enough that I could narrow down, so I had to keep pivoting over the last couple of decades. But yeah, and yeah, for sure, if anyone's interested in a whiskey, hit me up on for a dram every once in a while.
Is it from the distillery or not yet?
Not yet, but yeah,
one day.
Yeah, I'll give you a good sample of what we're shooting for. We have some good old workhorses in the industry working with us, so I can hopefully get you a brand that you'll recognize.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thanks for your time this morning. You're 13 hours ahead. I know that I woke you up early to do this podcast. Appreciate it. Loved our conversation. Loved the topics. And thank you again. And thanks to our listeners here who have joined us. See you on the next episode.
Thank you.